Healed Avoidant explains why avoidants break their own rules when a super empath detaches, and if that line already feels like it carries tension in it, it's because it does. Not the loud kind of tension people notice immediately, but the quiet psychological kind that builds when someone who once swore, "I don't do emotional dependency," suddenly finds themselves thinking about a person they were sure they had control over emotionally. There's something unsettling about it, because avoidants don't just make decisions randomly, they build internal systems, rules that feel almost like law inside their own minds. Rules like keeping distance even when they care. Rules like not over-engaging even when curiosity is there. Rules like staying in control of emotional exposure at all times, and then something happens that makes all of that collapse in a way they don't fully understand. Not because the rules were weak, but because something in the dynamic changes shape when the super empath stops doing the one thing that was quietly holding the entire emotional structure in place. Pursuit. Before going deeper into this, if you find yourself drawn to understanding these hidden psychological shifts that most people miss completely, make sure you subscribe, because what we're about to explore isn't just relationship theory, it's the invisible mechanics behind emotional control and loss of it. To understand why this collapse happens, you first have to understand that avoidants don't live without structure. In fact, their emotional world is built on structure more than most people realize. They develop internal rules not as a preference, but as protection. Keep distance when things feel too close. Don't respond too quickly when emotions feel intense. Limit vulnerability before it turns into dependency. Stay self-contained so no one can disrupt internal stability. These rules are not casual habits, they are deeply ingrained responses shaped by earlier emotional experiences where closeness may have felt unpredictable, overwhelming, or unsafe. Over time, these patterns become so automatic that they feel like personality traits rather than defense mechanisms. So when people say avoidants are cold or distant, they're often only seeing the surface layer of a much more complex system that is constantly working underneath to maintain emotional equilibrium. The irony is that these rules are not designed to destroy connection. They are designed to survive it. But survival comes at a cost. Emotional distance becomes the default setting, even when connection is actually desired. What makes this even more complicated is that these rules only feel stable when the emotional environment remains predictable. And this is where the super empath changes everything without even realizing it. The super empath isn't just someone who cares deeply, they engage deeply, feel deeply, and often respond with emotional consistency that can feel both comforting and overwhelming at the same time. At first, this presence feels grounding to the avoidant system. There is attention, availability, emotional openness. The dynamic forms a kind of controlled balance. One person gives energy, the other manages distance. And as long as this structure holds, the avoidant feels relatively in control. They can step forward, step back, regulate intensity, and maintain the internal illusion that nothing is overwhelming their emotional autonomy. But beneath that surface stability, something else is quietly forming. Because consistent emotional availability doesn't just create comfort, it also creates expectation. And expectation in the avoidant system slowly starts to feel like pressure, even when no pressure is intentionally applied. That's where the first crack begins forming, and it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It doesn't start with conflict or rejection, it starts with subtle internal discomfort that is hard to explain even to themselves. Moments where engagement starts to feel heavier than usual. Moments where responding feels slightly more effortful. Moments where emotional presence begins to feel like something they need to manage rather than something they can move through freely. And the strange part is that nothing externally may have changed. The super empath is still showing up, still caring, still offering connection. But internally, the avoidant system starts registering something different. Not danger exactly, but a shift in emotional weight. And once that shift is perceived, even faintly, the internal rules begin activating more strongly. Distance increases slightly. Response timing slows down. Emotional availability becomes more controlled. Not because feelings disappeared, but because regulation has intensified. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The super empath begins detaching. And this is not always a dramatic withdrawal. It's often subtle, less chasing, less emotional over-explaining, less urgency in response, less visible investment in keeping the connection alive at all costs. From the outside, it may look like calm, but to the avoidant system, it feels like something far more significant: unpredictability. Because now the emotional environment no longer behaves according to the old pattern. The structure that allowed controlled distance and controlled closeness begins dissolving. And for someone whose entire emotional regulation system depends on predictability, this creates internal disorientation. The absence of pursuit doesn't feel like peace, It feels like loss of control, not control over the other person, but control over the emotional rhythm that made the connection manageable. And this is where something unexpected begins to surface. The silence created by detachment doesn't just create space, it creates awareness. For the first time, the avoidant is not being emotionally directed toward. There is no constant energetic pull asking for engagement, no predictable emotional pattern to respond to. And in that absence, the emotional system starts doing something it rarely allows itself to do. It starts noticing what is missing. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in small internal interruptions. A thought that wasn't there before, a curiosity that doesn't fully belong, a sense that something familiar is no longer available on demand. And as strange as it sounds, this is often the exact point where the internal rules begin to weaken. Not because they are being broken by force, but because the system that supported them is no longer being reinforced in the same way. And once that reinforcement disappears, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the avoidant mind. It's not a sudden emotional breakdown or a dramatic realization like movies would suggest. It's quieter than that. It shows up in hesitation where there used to be certainty. It shows up in second thoughts after decisions that once felt automatic. It shows up in the strange feeling of wanting to reach out even when the internal rules are still insisting, don't. Because what's being disrupted here isn't just a relationship, it's a system of emotional predictability that the avoidant has relied on for a long time. When the super empath was fully engaged, the dynamic followed a pattern: emotional presence from one side, controlled distance from the other. That rhythm, even if unbalanced, was familiar. Familiarity creates comfort even in discomfort, but when detachment enters the picture, that rhythm breaks. And when the rhythm breaks, the avoidant mind no longer knows how to predict what comes next. That uncertainty becomes louder than the original fear they were trying to protect themselves from. And ironically, it is this uncertainty, not intimacy, that triggers the breaking of their own rules. Because those rules were never truly about avoiding people. They were about avoiding emotional unpredictability. So when the super empath detaches, the emotional environment flips. Suddenly there is no guaranteed access to attention, no predictable emotional availability, no structured reassurance of presence. And this absence creates something the avoidant system struggles with deeply: emotional ambiguity without control. In that space, the internal rules that once felt rigid begin to soften, not because they were wrong, but because they are no longer serving their original function. Distance no longer guarantees safety in the same way it used to. Instead, distance now creates curiosity, even discomfort. The mind starts revisiting moments that were previously dismissed. Conversations replay differently. Memories carry a slightly different emotional weight. Not because the past changed, but because the emotional context has changed. When someone is always available, their presence becomes background noise. But when that presence disappears or becomes uncertain, it suddenly becomes noticeable in a way that feels almost unsettling. And this is where avoidants begin breaking their own rules without consciously deciding to do so. A message is sent that shouldn't have been sent. A check-in happens that wasn't planned. A moment of emotional openness slips through a carefully controlled boundary. From the outside, it might look small, even insignificant, but internally it represents something much bigger, a violation of their own emotional structure, because these are not random actions. They are contradictions emerging between the old rule system and the new emotional experience being triggered by absence. The avoidant is not becoming a different person. They are temporarily stepping outside the boundaries they built to maintain emotional control. And what causes this shift is not pressure, not persuasion, not emotional demand. It is the removal of predictability. The super empath's detachment doesn't force them to act. It removes the emotional map they were using to avoid acting. At this stage, confusion becomes the dominant internal experience, because part of them still believes in the rules: keep distance, stay controlled, don't over-engage. But another part is reacting to something those rules didn't account for: emotional absence that feels active rather than passive. When someone is constantly available, the avoidant can regulate closeness on their terms. But when that availability disappears, the emotional landscape changes shape. Suddenly, there is no longer a guaranteed response waiting on the other side. And for a system that has built safety around emotional predictability, that absence creates a form of internal tension that cannot be ignored indefinitely. It doesn't immediately lead to clarity. Instead, it leads to contradiction. Wanting contact while resisting it, thinking about reaching out while trying to maintain distance, feeling curiosity while insisting on detachment. This internal conflict is precisely what causes the rule-breaking behavior that seems so confusing from the outside. And here is the part most people misunderstand. It is not the superempath's emotional intensity that breaks the avoidance rules. It is their withdrawal from that intensity. While consistent emotional availability can activate avoidance patterns, consistent absence of that availability activates something entirely different. Awareness of loss. Not loss in a dramatic sense, but loss of access, loss of predictability, loss of emotional certainty. The avoidance system is built to manage closeness by controlling distance. But when distance becomes the only option available, control starts to feel like it is slipping. And when control slips, the internal system begins testing its own boundaries to restore equilibrium. That testing is what appears externally as inconsistency or sudden re-engagement. What makes this moment even more psychologically complex is that avoidants rarely interpret their own behavior accurately in real time. When they break their own rules, they don't immediately label it as emotional shift or attachment response. Instead, they often rationalize it. They might tell themselves it's curiosity, or closure, or timing, or coincidence. But beneath those explanations, something deeper is happening. The emotional system that was designed to prevent dependency is briefly becoming exposed to the very dependency it was trying to avoid. Not through pursuit, but through absence. Because absence, when paired with prior emotional connection, creates a different kind of pull. One that is harder to control precisely because it is not being actively resisted by another person anymore. There is no pressure to push against, only silence that begins to echo louder than expected. And as that silence continues, the internal rules don't fully disappear, but they lose their rigidity. They bend, they soften, they get temporarily overridden by emotional impulse. This is why avoidance can appear inconsistent during these phases, because what you are seeing is not a stable change in personality, but a temporary collapse of the emotional structure they normally rely on to regulate connection. And what triggered that collapse was not pressure, not chasing, not confrontation, but detachment that removed predictability from the system entirely. And when that internal structure collapses, even temporarily, what follows is something the avoidant rarely has language for. Because they are not used to observing themselves in moments where their own rules stop feeling absolute. From the outside, it may look like simple inconsistency, reaching out one moment, withdrawing the next, but internally it feels more like standing in unfamiliar emotional terrain without a map. The same person who once felt safest in control now finds themselves reacting to something they didn't anticipate, the emotional weight of absence that feels different from the comfort of distance. Distance used to feel like protection. Now it feels like uncertainty. And that shift alone is enough to create motion where there was previously stillness. Not because they have suddenly become more attached in a conscious, stable way, but because their internal system is trying to re-establish equilibrium. The rules that once kept emotional engagement at a manageable level are no longer working in the same way, so the mind begins experimenting. A message here, a check there, a moment of checking in that doesn't fully align with their usual behavior. Each action is less about strategy and more about regulation, an attempt to understand what has changed without fully acknowledging that something meaningful has. This is where the illusion of control begins to crack in a deeper way. Avoidants often believe they are managing connection through deliberate emotional pacing, deciding when to engage, when to withdraw, when to maintain distance. But when the superempath detaches, that sense of control shifts subtly. Suddenly, engagement is no longer guaranteed on demand. The emotional environment is no longer predictable. And without predictability, the internal system that relies on control begins to destabilize. What was once a carefully balanced rhythm becomes something unpredictable and unstructured. And in that unstructured space, the avoidant mind begins doing something it normally resists. It starts prioritizing feeling over rule. Not consciously, not permanently, but in fleeting moments where emotion overrides structure. That is why they can find themselves reaching out without fully understanding why, or revisiting the connection mentally in ways they had previously shut down. It is not a conscious decision to abandon their rules. It is a temporary suspension of them under emotional recalibration. At the same time, something equally important is happening on the other side of the dynamic. The superempath's detachment is not loud, not reactive, not designed to provoke. It is grounded. And that groundedness is precisely what makes it so disruptive. Because the avoidant system is used to emotional energy that responds to their movement, chasing when they withdraw, intensifying when they pull back, re-engaging when they become distant. But detachment removes that feedback loop entirely. There is no emotional escalation to regulate against, no pursuit to push away, no intensity to manage, just space. And in that space, the avoidant is left alone with the emotional imprint of the connection itself. This is where memory begins behaving differently. not as nostalgia but as active emotional data. Moments that once felt neutral begin carrying weight. Conversations that were previously dismissed begin resurfacing with new meaning. And the absence of ongoing emotional interaction forces the mind to process what was previously being regulated externally by the dynamic itself. This is also where avoidants begin experiencing something they rarely name directly: emotional echo. It is not the presence of the person that triggers them anymore. It is the absence of the pattern they were used to. The predictability of emotional access is gone, and what remains is a lingering sense of unfinished emotional processing. That is why they may return not with clarity, but with confusion, not with resolution, but with curiosity. And from the outside, this can look like contradiction. Why reach out if distance was the goal? Why re-engage if space was what they wanted? But internally, the answer is not contradiction, it is recalibration. The system is trying to understand whether the emotional connection still exists in a form that feels manageable now that the old structure has dissolved. And in that process, the avoidant may temporarily act against their own previous rules, not because they have changed those rules permanently, but because the emotional environment no longer supports them in the same way. What makes this even more complex is that these moments of re-engagement are often followed by withdrawal again. And this is where many people get confused and assume nothing has changed. But the truth is, something has changed. It is just unstable. The emotional system has not yet found a new equilibrium. So it oscillates: approach, retreat, curiosity, distance, engagement, silence. Not because the avoidant is playing a game, but because the internal regulation process is still active. They are testing emotional boundaries in real time without fully realizing they are doing it. And each time they move closer and then pull away again, they are gathering information about how the new dynamic feels compared to the old one. Whether connection still feels threatening, whether absence feels more uncomfortable than closeness used to, whether control still provides the same sense of safety it once did. And underneath all of this, something more subtle begins forming that often goes unnoticed until much later. Recognition of emotional significance. Not necessarily love in the traditional sense, not necessarily commitment, but recognition that the connection carried more emotional weight than their original rules accounted for. And this recognition is what slowly undermines the rigidity of those rules over time. Because rules built for emotional protection begin to lose authority when the emotional experience no longer fits within their original logic. The avoidant is no longer just responding to closeness or distance, they are responding to the emotional memory of what that connection felt like when it was still active and how different it feels now that it has changed form. This is why detachment does not force change, but it does reveal it. It removes the structure that was containing the emotional experience and exposes what remains underneath. And what remains is often more complicated than either side initially understood. Because once control is no longer anchored by predictable emotional feedback, both curiosity and emotional awareness begin operating more freely. And in that freedom, avoidants often encounter the very thing their rules were designed to avoid in the first place. Not pressure from another person, but the internal realization that emotional connection does not disappear just because they withdraw from it. And that realization is where everything begins to settle into a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. Because once emotional connection is recognized internally, it cannot be fully unfelt back into silence again. Avoidants don't suddenly transform into completely different people at this stage, but something fundamental shifts in how their internal rules are experienced. Those rules that once felt like firm protections start feeling slightly more negotiable, not because fear has disappeared, but because the emotional evidence has changed. The mind begins to register a contradiction it can no longer ignore. Distance does not erase attachment, and control does not eliminate emotional imprint. This is where the detachment of the superempath creates its deepest effect. Not by chasing, not by demanding, but by removing the predictable structure that allowed avoidance to remain unquestioned. Without that structure, the emotional system is forced into awareness. And awareness, even in small doses, creates pressure of a different kind. Not external pressure, but internal pressure. The kind that comes from realizing that what was once easily regulated is now harder to dismiss. In this state, avoidants often experience something they rarely articulate clearly: emotional reinterpretation. They begin reevaluating past interactions not from the perspective of control, but from the perspective of absence. Moments that once felt manageable begin to feel more meaningful in hindsight. Conversations that were once compartmentalized start to resurface with emotional texture. And most importantly, the emotional weight of the connection becomes more noticeable when it is no longer being actively stabilized by the other person's presence. This is why detachment often feels so different to the avoidance system compared to pursuit. When someone is chasing, the avoidant can interpret that energy through familiar rules: distance, response timing, emotional pacing. But when that energy disappears, there is no longer anything external shaping the emotional experience. The connection is left to exist in its raw form, without interference, and in that raw form it often feels more significant than previously acknowledged. This is also where the internal conflict becomes more visible in behavior, even if it is not consciously recognized. The avoidant may